What if Bruno Mars got into psychobilly? This week we'll be taking a look at how a Hawaiian Elvis impersonator ended up becoming one of the most enduring pop stars of the modern era, and also casting our eye over the psychobilly movement, a ghoulish zombified hybrid of punk and rockabilly that somehow refuses to die. All that and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload new What If videos on my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesdays I follow it with one of these companion videos discussing the artists and genres involved in that What If video, and also sharing a bit of my creative process. The idea of the What If videos is that every week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Uptown Funk by Mark Ronson featuring Bruno Mars, and I tried to reimagine that as a psychobilly song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. I must admit I'm no massive Bruno Mars fan, and I can't say that his career has had a massive impact on me as a music listener, but in preparation for doing this video, I was just having a little glance back over his career, and it occurred to me that actually an awful lot of those songs have just been kind of in the background of my general life for getting on for 20 years now, which is absolutely crazy. And actually when you look back over those hits, it becomes clear that he's actually a pretty canny and talented artist with the ability to turn his hand to quite a diverse array of tricks. So I did start to gather slightly more appreciation for his talent. I gather he was born in Hawaii as Peter Hernandez. I never knew that Bruno Mars wasn't his real name until I just looked into it for this video. Apparently was nicknamed Bruno by his dad, owing to the fact that he apparently as a small child looked a little bit like Bruno Sammartino, the great pro wrestler, which I thought was quite a pleasing fact. Apparently grew up with quite an array of music around him, some of which came from his uncle who was an Elvis impersonator. So apparently as a youngster, the soon-to-be Bruno Mars began performing by impersonating Elvis himself, and then also graduated to impersonating Michael Jackson, which I think you can see in his style to this day. Had a bit of a gradual entry into the sort of mainstream pop industry. He's part of a production team called the Smeezingtons, who work with a bunch of artists. I guess the really big hit was Fuck You, the CeeLo Green song, which I didn't know, but now that I know that Bruno Mars was involved in that, it makes perfect sense. And he also started doing sort of little guest appearances on a bunch of different artists' songs. But I guess the really big breakthrough was the Doo-Wops and Hooligans album, which was 2010, I think. And that was an absolute monster of a record. Like, all the singles from that were just everywhere all over the radio for so long, and a bunch of them have never really left. And he's kind of been just a pretty constant presence in popular culture ever since. I see a bunch of people criticising him for the fact that a lot of his stuff seems to rely on pastiching previous eras of pop. So, okay, he's doing sort of 70s R&B now. Oh, now he's moved on to early 80s funk. Oh, now he's nudging into the early 90s and maybe things are going a little bit New Jack Swing, that sort of thing. And I can kind of see that, but I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. In a way, I kind of admire the fact that he's able to sort of turn his hand to these different styles, and if nothing he's doing is exactly what you call groundbreaking, there can be a certain amount of pleasure to be had from just a really well done throwback, and he's certainly provided that. I think it also serves to remind people of some of the overlooked styles from pop's past that maybe other artists hadn't been picking up on, because I don't know if anyone else was really sort of mining that Gap Band Kool and the Gang style of funk before Uptown Funk came out. But people loved that. So yeah, not necessarily doing anything groundbreaking, but part of me would rather have someone reinventing himself by dipping into different eras of pop's past than frantically chasing whatever the current hip new trend is, as so many other artists do. Not everyone can be a groundbreaker, but there's something to be said for just being really good at crafting pop songs in different styles and being a consummate entertainer. I think Bruno Mars is both, so credit where it's due there, I think. As I say, from what I can gather from just doing the most cursory possible bit of reading about him, it does sound like his sort of pick and mix approach to pop's history is rooted in his early musical education from his family, where he grew up listening to a wide range of kind of classic pop and soul and rock and roll and stuff. And as I say, Elvis was a big part of that, so I do know he has at least some rockabilly in his past. So maybe that's what I was picking up on when I picked this song to turn into a psychobilly track. I've had the vague idea of attempting something in a psychobilly style for a while. It's a bit of an underappreciated genre and one that does interest me a little bit. If you're not familiar with psychobilly, in a nutshell, it's simply a fusion of rockabilly with punk rock. Most people generally, if they're tracing the roots of psychobilly, would say that it starts with the Cramps, which, you know, is a pretty reasonable assertion. Oh, I mean, there are certainly original rockabilly acts from way back into the 50s who had an anarchic, punky energy. I mean, if you think of the likes of the Johnny Burnett trio, some of their stuff kind of sounded like punk back in the 1950s. But the Cramps, you definitely have to credit as the flashpoint for psychobilly as its own genre. I wouldn't necessarily say that the Cramps themselves are actually strictly a psychobilly band, because although they obviously were an early punk band with a very strong rockabilly influence, kind of feel like there was a bit too much other stuff going on in there as well to be ever really considered pure psychobilly. They had that whole nuggetsy 60s garage thing going on, a psychedelic edge, surfy bits. There's a bit more of a kind of all-encompassing mashup of some of the gnarlier, trashier bits of Americana. So not really the pure psychobilly sound that you hear a little bit later on, but they're definitely the clear forerunners of that, both in the adoption of rockabilly song structures and sounds, particularly Poison Ivy's amazing twangy guitar and Lux Interior's great vocal stylings, and also the horror and B-movie imagery that they use. That was a big factor that bleeds over into the psychobilly movement proper. Where you get the real start of the psychobilly as a movement is when that Cramps influence filters over to English bands like the Meteors particularly, who really started to solidify a proper psychobilly style, sped up rockabilly with a kind of UK punk delivery and attitude. Strong visual identity as well starts to emerge. A style that mixes elements of punk and rockabilly, you know, the hairstyles that have the kind of big rockabilly quiff but with the sides and back shaved, so it's kind of almost somewhere between a rockabilly hairdo and a mohawk, that sort of thing. So this whole wave of bands starts to emerge, playing these often horror-themed, snotty, fast rockabilly tunes. Demented Are Go and the Coffin Nails, King Kurt, the Guana Bats, and there are stylistic differences between them. Some of them lean much closer to traditional rockabilly, and some of them are much harder, punkier sound, but generally all following a pretty common path. And it was a pretty thriving scene there throughout most of the 80s, really. I first really heard psychobilly on the old compilation series Stompin' at the Clubfoot, which is a series of LPs that collected together live recordings from this club that opened in Hammersmith in 1982, which became kind of the home of psychobilly. And some great stuff on those. And that 80s period, say like 82 to 87, was definitely really the heyday of UK psychobilly, but although the initial wave of popularity did kind of die off a little bit after that, by that point the movement had kind of spread, so you start getting loads more European bands springing up. The influence of the UK bands gets back to the States, so people who maybe never actually picked up on the Cramps the first time round are hearing their influence kind of filtered back through these UK bands. And although it's never maybe captured the highs of that initial burst of energy, it's really kind of formed a solid, long-standing niche in the sort of underground music scene alongside goth and horror punk and all these other subgenres. Bands like Tiger Army and the Horror Pops and the Living End are all really popular. Some of the more recent psychobilly stuff that I've heard, to me, doesn't really have much rockabilly left in it at all. Quite a few of those bands sound a bit more like horror punk or even pop punk that just happens to have a double bass on it, but I guess that would make more sense if I'd been following the scene through and I'd seen how that evolved. And just because it's not my cup of tea, it doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile. But the stuff that appeals to me is always going to be the stuff that basically just sounds like a kind of revved up, tattooed Gene Vincent. Well, yeah, anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenarios. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's 2014. In a universe not entirely unlike ours, Mark Ronson is trying to get together some tracks for his forthcoming album. I just realised I didn't actually talk about Mark Ronson, even though technically it's his song rather than Bruno Mars's, but I just didn't really have much to say about him, so yeah, what are you going to do? But yeah, so in this alternate timeline, Mark Ronson's getting songs ready for this, decides to call in Bruno Mars. Bruno Mars gladly accepts the invite. They get together, start jamming, trying to work up a song. They end up fixating on this 80s funk groove. They're really happy with how this is going. It gradually develops into a song and they start recording it, but then Bruno has a little light bulb moment and goes, hang on a minute, doesn't this sound a little bit like Oops Upside Your Head by the Gap Band? Which, incidentally, it does, which is why members of the Gap Band now receive full songwriting credits on Uptown Funk. But in this timeline, Bruno Mars actually points this out while they're attempting to record it, and Mark Ronson has to concede that, okay, he does have a point. So what are they going to do? They don't want to just scrap the song, so they figure if they just rework it into a different style, maybe the similarity won't be so noticeable. So reaching back into his early days impersonating Elvis, Bruno starts playing the song in more of a kind of rockabilly style. Mark likes how this is going, he likes the feel, just doesn't seem to quite have the energy that he feels the song requires, so he keeps urging Bruno Mars to play this rockabilly version of the song a bit faster and more aggressively, and it gradually works up more and more of a head of steam until eventually it's absolutely barreling along with loads of aggression, and that's the version that they finally use. So this high-speed, snotty rockabilly version of Uptown Funk comes out as a single, and it's a massive worldwide success, and as a result of that, Bruno Mars becomes the figurehead for a worldwide revival of psychobilly. So, in attempting to convert Uptown Funk from an 80s funk jam very much in the manner of Oops Upside Your Head into a psychobilly type track, my first step as ever was just getting the original isolated vocals, dropping them into GarageBand and syncing them up to the grid. There was quite a lot of stuff that I wanted to cut out because obviously with a funk track, it's built on repetition, it's about establishing a groove and repeating that groove round, so there's a lot of time in the original track where it's just things looping around. In a psychobilly song, you don't really have room to do that. You want it to be short and to the point, so I cut out loads of those bits, edited all the remaining bits I did want to keep together, and sped up the tempo loads because I really wanted it to kind of rock it along. Also, just popped a bit of slapback echo on that as well, just to give it a bit more of a 50s sound too. That done, next step was popping some drums on. Tried to keep it pretty simple. Quite a few psychobilly bands I've seen over the years have quite pared down drum kits. Some of them just using kind of a kick and a snare and one cymbal, that kind of thing. So it's pretty much kick, snare, hi-hat and a ride cymbal, I think. Just really simple, driving. Bass was next, and I could have gone for electric bass, but I did want that kind of stand-up bass sound, so played the bass in on the MIDI keyboard with GarageBand's studio upright bass sound, which it's an alright sound, but it's very warm and bassy, a bit too much for a psychobilly thing, because what you really want is that kind of percussive clank and the slapping sound as well, which obviously the GarageBand sound doesn't have. So having played the bass line in, I tried to EQ it to sound more like a not particularly well mic'd real bass played hard, and then to try and get a bit of that slap effect, I had a separate track with my electric bass of me just slapping the string into the fretboard approximately where the slap should come on the stand-up bass line. It's not very accurately done, it doesn't sound completely convincing, but hopefully in the mix it just gives a little bit of that effect. And guitar-wise, I've got two guitars on there. For a rhythm guitar, I decided to make it sound more like an old-school rockabilly thing. I'd go for an acoustic guitar. There are a few psychobilly bands who did use acoustic guitar as part of their sound. The one that I used the video footage of was Iguana Bats. So taking their example, I thought acoustic rhythm guitar, dead simple, just bashing out the chords. And then for lead guitar, obviously I'm using an electric guitar for that. I used my homemade Telecaster, which has a suitable kind of 50s-ish twang to it. And the sound I went for, I think it's the sim that's basically meant to be a Fender Bassman, which is a fairly classic rockabilly amp, and tried to crank it into fairly overdriven but not out and out metal distortion, but then also with quite a lot of reverb, so it's got that cavernous 50s feel to it as well, alternating between some twangy low-end riffs, some slightly jazzy chordings, some little bits of lead up the neck as well. Fairly traditional rockabilly stuff, but just played with a fair amount of snotty attitude. And then for the video, as ever, started out first by just finding a clip of Bruno Mars performing Uptown Funk back around when it came out to use as a basis. So we've got that performance synced up to my version of the song. Obviously his performances with his backing band, the Hooligans, who look great if you want a funk band, but I didn't. I want a psychobilly band to be backing him. So went and found a bunch of footage from the old Club Foot gigs. I think most of it's, as I say, the Guana Bats, because they had the acoustic rhythm guitar, which I wanted. There might be a bit from a Batmobile gig on there too, just so we've got some suitably psychobilly looking instrumentalist there providing the backing, and also a bit of the slam dancing going on that you'd find at a typical psychobilly gig too, just to give a bit of a feel for one of those gigs. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I had a great time putting it together. It's not one of my more conceptually elaborate tracks. You know, sometimes I have all kinds of what I think are clever reasons for doing these tracks. This one I just thought this song would work in this style and it'd be fun to do, so that's why I did it. And yeah, I think it came out okay. Hopefully you agree. If you did like it, please let me know down in the comments. And if you want to like, share, subscribe, all that stuff really helps the channel. I do appreciate it. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to take a look at, I always welcome your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.